In this lesson, we're going to begin deployment of one of the branch office locations within the test lab environment. So let's just go back and take another look at the advanced scenario that we mapped out way back in the early lessons as we were discussing the setup of the lab. So I've already deployed this network here in the middle, which is the Sydney location. That's all up and running. So now what I'm going to do is actually start deploying this branch office over here, which is going to be known as the Brisbane location, sitting in this 192.168.101 subnet. And this branch office location will just consist of a domain controller, a single Exchange server that will be installed as a multi-role server, and then one workstation just to simulate that client behavior within that branch office location. Now I've already deployed the domain controller for the site. I'll assume that you can work out how to install and configure another domain controller within your existing test lab environment. You're just adding another domain controller to the domain, so that's not too difficult. And you'll also need to set up the networking if you're using the vRTA router software like I am. So just refer back to those earlier lessons where we took a look at how to configure vRTA router for routing and networking between the subnets, if you need a quick refresher there to get you through that configuration. So this is my Exchange server. I've named it BNE EX1 and just given it a static IP address. I've joined it to the domain, and on the file system here I've just copied over the installation files for Exchange 2010 with Service Pack 2. Now, as I'll be installing a typical server, there's not going to be really too much to it. So Exchange 2010 setup just lets me know that I need to install the .NET framework before I can continue with the setup. So I'll go ahead and sort that out now. Just import module server manager and add Windows feature. So I've just run add Windows feature net-framework to install the .NET framework. That's been successful, no restart required, and I'll just restart the Exchange setup. Now we can proceed with step 4, the installation of Microsoft Exchange. Alright, so we've been through this setup wizard a few times already while installing the previous servers, so I won't hold us up. We'll just skip through the license agreement and error reporting. And the installation type that we're going to choose here is the typical Exchange server installation, which will install all of the roles: hub transport, client access, mailbox, and management tools. And as usual, just tick this box to automatically install the Windows Server roles and features required for Exchange. Now, this will not be an internet-facing server. It's in a branch office location that does not directly connect to the internet. So all of the incoming connections from the internet for clients such as Outlook Web Access will be published through that main head office location, the Sydney office location. So we don't need to configure any external domain names here. And again, your choice for the customer experience improvement program. And we'll just let Exchange run now with those readiness checks and make sure everything's okay. So my readiness checks were all successful. I'll click install. We'll just let that run through. It is a multi-role server, so it is going to take quite a while to complete this installation. So we'll come back to it when it's finished. Now that setup has completed. There is a restart required. So I will go ahead and do that. And after the reboot, just go ahead and install the update rollup to bring your server up to the same level as the other servers in your lab. Okay, so the server is now installed with Exchange, and what I'll just do is jump into the Exchange management shell. We'll take a look at some of the other configurations just to finish this server off. And while that's loading, you can see here in Windows Explorer I have some additional disks, a data disk and a transaction log disk that have been added to my virtual machine. I've already formatted and mounted those as E drive and F drive, and that's where I'm going to put the Mailbox database and transaction logs for this server. Okay, so Exchange Management Shell has finished initializing. So let's take a look at the Mailbox databases within the organization. So Mailbox Database 1 and 2, which were configured in the Sydney location in the database availability group, they're still there. And now we've got this new Mailbox database with this randomly generated number appended to the name, which is on BNE EX1. So that's the Mailbox database that was created for us automatically once again by Exchange 2010 setup. So let's take a closer look at a Mailbox database on BNE EX1. So I'm just going to get Mailbox database and use the name of this particular Mailbox database. I'm going to pipe the output to the format list commandlet so we can see all of the details of the attributes and values for those attributes on that Mailbox database. Okay, so there it is there. It's got all of the default settings, such as the quotas, set it around 2 gigabytes, and just scrolling down, this is the EDB file path. So that's the path and the file system to the actual database file itself. You can see that it is going by default to the C drive in the program files directory where the Exchange server installation binaries are, and that's obviously not where we want that EDB file to be located. We've also got the log folder path, which is going to the same location. So again, that's not where we want that particular those particular logs to be located. We're going to put them on a dedicated disk. There's plenty of other details there as well. So we want to relocate the database and transaction log files, that EDB file path and the log folder path. Want to locate them on different drives. So it's going to be E drive for the database file and F drive for the logs. And what we can do is use the move database path commandlet, and we'll put in the identity or the name of the Mailbox database that we want to move the path for. Start by entering in the path for the EDB file path. So that will be // actually I'll wrap that in quotes, // I'm going to call it Mailbox Database 3, and we'll get to that name in a moment. And again, Mailbox Database 3.edb. So we're putting it in the E drive in a folder called Mailbox Database 3, and the file name itself is Mailbox Database 3.edb. And we also want to move the log folder path, and that will be F drive Mailbox Database 3, and there's no file name required for the log drives. The log folder path, you're just specifying the folder that will contain all of those transaction log files. And you'll get prompted to confirm that you want to move the Mailbox database path, because it will dismount the Mailbox database while it's being moved, obviously. So I'm going to say yes, and yes again. That operation has completed without error. Let's take a look back in the file system in the E drive. Now we've got the folder, database file is there, and so is the content index catalog information. And we can also see the transaction log files on the F drive, where we told the Exchange to put them in that Mailbox Database 3 folder. Now, just one last task. We'll go back into the C drive where those files previously were located. Okay, so there was the folder that contained the Mailbox Database and transaction log files previously. We can see it's left this catalog data folder behind. Now, if I try to delete that, I actually get an error that the action can't be completed. The reason for that is because the indexing service has still got a lock on that folder and the files within it. So even though the database and transaction log files have been moved, the indexing service, which is a separate service, has a lock on those files. So jumping back into the shell, let's have a look at the services running on the server at the moment that have the word Exchange in them. And we've got this MS Exchange search service here, so I'm going to copy the name of that. That's the service name for the short name for the Microsoft Exchange Search Indexer. That's the service that happens to have a lock on that folder at the moment. And we'll just restart that service to release the lock on those files and folders. And now we're able to delete those files. And we can even get rid of the entire folder just to tidy up behind as well. Okay, so I did mention that I was pointing out the name of the Mailbox Database is still this Mailbox Database and randomly generated number string afterwards. So we'd like to give that a more sensible name within the organization. So if we just if we just use set Mailbox Database and the Mailbox Database name, and we could just go ahead and change the name to something a little bit more sensible. I'm going to call it Mailbox Database 3. So you recall I've already got a Mailbox Database 1 and a Mailbox Database 2 in my organization. Even though this is an Exchange server that is separate to the other servers hosting Mailbox Databases 1 and 2, just remember that all of your database names need to be unique within the entire organization. So just because we're installing now a separate server doesn't mean that we can call this one Mailbox Database 1 like the other one. They need to be completely unique names within the entire organization, not just on a particular server. So nice and easy, we've changed the name of that Mailbox Database, and now when we run get Mailbox Database, we see a nice neat series of database names: Mailbox Database 1, 2 and 3, and the servers that they reside on. Now hopefully you also recall in the previous lessons where we looked at client access server arrays that a recommended practice is to configure a CAS array even in sites where you don't plan to do highly available pairs or more of client access servers. So here in this Brisbane site we only have a single server, but it may still make sense to configure that client access server array, and that gives us a nice tidy DNS name that can be used for the RPC client access server that could later scale out for high availability or be portable to move it across to point to a different server entirely. So here in PowerShell, let's have a look at get Mailbox Database, and I'm just going to select the name and the RPC client access server properties of each of the Mailbox databases and just put those in a table. So there's Mailbox Database 1, 2 and 3. The two Mailbox databases in the DAG in the Sydney location have this RPC client access server configured to point to the CAS array namespace in that site. But here in the Brisbane site, by default that database is still pointing to the fully qualified domain name of the client access server itself. So let's go ahead and create a new client access array object here in the Brisbane site. So having a look at the existing one, it has a name of Outlook-SID. It's in the site of Sydney and has a fully qualified domain name of outlook-sid.exchangeserverpro.net. So we'll just keep that naming convention for our new one in the Brisbane location. Say new client access array with the name of Outlook-BNE. The site is Brisbane, and the fully qualified domain name is outlook-bne.exchangeserverpro.net. Okay, let's have a look at get client access array again. Now we can see the two of them together, one for each site, and it's automatically detected that BNE-EX1 is the only member of the client access array, remembering that that basically just means the client access servers within that site. It doesn't mean members in the sense of membership within a load balancing cluster or anything like that. Now, obviously there's no record in DNS for Outlook-BNE, so we need to go ahead and configure that one as well. The IP address of my client access server in Brisbane is 192.168.101.11. So I'll jump over to my Brisbane domain controller, BNE DC1. Open up the DNS management, and here in my exchangeserverpro.net zone, I'll create a new A record of Outlook-BNE and point that to the IP address of the client access server. Okay, so there it is, sitting just next to the Outlook-Sydney one. So jumping back to the Exchange server, I'll just see if that resolves in DNS. Okay, so that's resolving successfully from the Brisbane domain controller. It may not resolve if I was to run that query within my Sydney site, because I've only just created that DNS record and it still needs to replicate between the two sites. But that's okay, we can still go ahead and do the last step. So recalling that when we look at the RPC client access server attribute on Mailbox Database 3, it's still set to the wrong name. It's still set to the fully qualified domain name of the server. We want to change that to the fully qualified domain name of our Outlook-BNE client access server array. So set Mailbox Database. We're concerned with Mailbox Database 3, and we'll just change the RPC client access server attribute to Outlook-BNE.exchangeserverpro.net. And rerunning that get Mailbox Database, we can see now the Mailbox Database 3 has changed to Outlook-BNE.exchangeserverpro.net. Our Brisbane server will also need an SSL certificate installed, but it's not quite as complicated as the internet-facing servers as far as which SSL names, which server names are required to be in that SSL certificate. Basically all we need is a certificate that includes the fully qualified domain name of the server itself. Now it does have one of those installed by default, but of course that is self-signed. It is a self-signed certificate, so the clients will not trust that self-signed certificate. So we'll just go ahead and use the new Exchange certificate wizard. I'll give it a friendly name of Exchange 2010. So once again, as with the other ones, I'm not going to use a wildcard. All we need to do is just choose any one of these and enable it. I'll get rid of the other server names. I don't need those included in this particular certificate, so that all I've got is BNE-EX1.exchangeserverpro.net. I can get rid of these other names. and just generate that certificate request as you did for your other servers, and take that server request file, provision yourself a certificate from your CA if you chose to run one internally, and then import that into your Exchange server in the branch office location, and complete that process of enabling the certificate for the web services.